Hi there, welcome to Hogwash History Season 2. We have made it, folks. Instead of me just sitting here talking to you about the Neolithic transition into first civilizations, instead I am going to be talking to you about the Neolithic transition into ancient civilizations with a little help from their friends. In my last video, I said something along the lines of, this is the last time I'm going to have to go over this, and it's not true. We will always be talking about the Neolithic Revolution. There is no escape. Through what we're going to be looking at, and realistically this is going to take a year to get through, is we're going to be looking at civilizations between the period of 2000 BC to 1500 BC, and then maybe moving a little bit beyond that. Today we're starting with Minoan Crete, which almost sort of is a first civilization, but not quite. So that's why it's in this category and not the season 1 category that we already did. And for those of you who are new here, I've already done some videos on Sumer, Old Kingdom Egypt, Indus River Valley Civilization, China, very early China though. So the Xia, and that's almost like half conjecture. And then I did a wrap up of comparative civilizations, which hopefully is useful if you're interested. And I took a little break and had a little time to research and have a good Christmas. And now we're back. Now we're back to doing some more history, and we're starting out in the Mediterranean, and we're going to be parked in the Mediterranean for a while. We'll get a second bite at the apple through this season at, say, Middle Kingdom Egypt, and we're going to go back to China for a little bit. So I'm really excited for all of the history that we're going to be covering on this channel, and I hope that you are interested in hearing me talk about it. Anyways, the purpose of this series though is to give an overview of civilizations, and we're kind of putting a mind towards what made these civilizations significant. Why are we still talking about them today? We're going to be asking a few questions like, how did this group of people experience change over time? How do they compare to their contemporaries? And a little bit of what makes these civilizations unique within their own time period. And what I'm also really excited about is we're going to be able to start asking questions like, does this civilization have any effects on us in the modern time? Because I guarantee a question that you have asked yourself about history, or at least that kids, I've heard a million kids ask this question, is why do we have to learn this? None of this matters. And to a certain extent, they're right. A lot of it doesn't matter. But I also think that the study of the past really helps us see how we got to where we are today. And we get to start seeing kind of those first little influences. Now that we are entering the Mediterranean Bronze Age, we get to talk about one of the first real experiments in globalization, and we're going to be talking about that from a whole lot of perspectives. So we're going to be doing Minoa today, we'll get to mainland Greece a little bit later, and then we'll be doing the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and Middle Kingdom Egypt. So that's all Mediterranean talking to each other, kind of an experiment in globalization, which is pretty much the first of its kind within the ancient world. And then from there, we're going to be looking a little bit at, is this sort of that beginning point of Western civilization? So Minoan Crete is considered to be the first European civilization, though it is a European civilization that is very Near Eastern and Egyptian focused. The information within this video is meant to be introductory to Minoan Crete. Therefore, there will be plenty of generalizations, and I also am not a specific expert in Minoan Crete. Apologize in advance for any names that I get wrong. Feel free to correct in the comments so that anyone who's watching this can read those comments and be like, this is how I should actually be pronouncing that. That Karen lady doesn't know what she's talking about. And with pronunciations, you might be right, because I have the South in my mouth and it does not want to say words the way that they are meant to be said sometimes.
I say super Southern one, oil. I don't even know how to say it, like how to y'all.
Also, this video is going to attempt to be concise. I don't think it will be. I think this is going to be an hour ultimately. If it's less, then thank the editing gods. But I hope it's good and I hope you enjoy it. So let's get to how this video is going to be structured, which is going to be coming at you in a few separate parts. First, we're going to be discussing early myth and archaeology and art in Crete, and why, if you are kind of looking to study Aegean Bronze Age, I would really suggest an introductory book to help you kind of get this straight in your head. The unfortunate truth is that there is a mess of a timeline that you have to get through and a lot of nomenclature to understand, which is very self-imposed by historians, and it takes a little bit to get your mindset around it. I almost recommend that you have a table of dates and comparative times with you while reading something like like this, which is an introductory to Minoan Crete that I found very helpful. I really recommend this one if you're looking for a place to start. Here's your recommendation if that's what you came here for. But the problem with that introduction is that he doesn't include a lot of dates within chapters, so I kind of had to do a lot of flipping throughout and keep track of where we were in history, especially since I view the whole plate version of history, where I want to know what other people are doing at the same time so that I have a little bit of a comparative point of view. Like, it's great what they're doing in the Aegean, but I also kind of want to know what's happening in Egypt at the same time, and it's really important to me to keep those timelines straight. After we go through myth, archaeology, and art, which kind of may not make sense as a cohesive thing, but it does when I talk about it, hopefully. We're going to be moving on to geography, flora, and fauna, and why they impacted the development of Crete the way that it did. There is a reason that urbanization came to Sumer in Egypt in a way that it just didn't come to Crete. So that's something to kind of discuss, and I think the geography is really important to that discussion. And then we're also going to be looking a little bit at vertical agriculture, just like the Andean mountain civilization, which I also did a video on. And then we will do the history portion of this video, where I will do my best to kind of give you a rough timeline of development in Crete from the Neolithic period to the late Minoan period. Our clock is pretty much going to stop in around 1500 BC, though I'll kind of give a really quick, like 1500 to 1000. This is what's happening in the Aegean. Our clock stops because there is a volcanic eruption on Thera, modern day Santorini in Greece, and it causes some disruptions. And then there's a whole bunch of debate about what even is happening on Crete, who is in charge, what that looks like realistically. There's debate even about when this explosion happened. So that's where I pause the clock. From there, we'll wrap up by discussing a few points of interest in Minoan development, especially their religion and their overall impact as Mediterranean juggernauts / pirates. The pirate part is a joke, but also any society that was really dependent on maritime means for their economy is a little piratey. All right, so archaeology, myth, art. We can't get away from Homer and Hesiod. So I don't know if you've read these. They're really great primary sources. I would recommend that you read the Odyssey, and then Hesiod's Theogony is also really very excellent. That one is very short and very easy to read, and it's just mythology for ancient Greece if you're going with Hesiod, and then the Odyssey and the Iliad would go with that also, wouldn't it? And if you really want a cliff notes, I, in doing my research for this, discovered the musical epic.
600 men under my command, with only one goal in mind. Make it back alive to our homeland.
Which was a lot of fun to listen to. I really enjoyed that. So if there's something you can go listen to that's very consumable and easy to digest. My kids loved it. It was a little inappropriate maybe for my children, but we homeschool, so it's a classic. Sure, watch Odysseus drop that baby off a wall and him slaughter 108 suitors. That's cool. Anyways, Homer refers to Crete in this way. There is a land called Crete in the middle of the wine blue water, a handsome country and fertile sea grit, and there are many people in it, innumerable. There are 90 cities, and there is Knossos, the great city, the place where Minos was king and conversed with great Zeus every 9 years. Homer knew Minos as the son of Zeus and Europa, and according to Thucydides, Minos was the first king to build a navy. He conquered the Cyclades, colonized many islands, and cleared up the Aegean Sea of pirates, a very important thing to do. There is evidence that does confirm the Minoan spread of naval warfare throughout the Aegean, so they were a naval Aegean power. After his death, Minos was allegedly appointed as the golden sceptered ruler of Hades, and Crete was also the home of Daedalus, and he's the architect of the Cretan labyrinth. Zeus, father of gods and men, was born on a mountain in Crete. So the Greek myth of Crete begins with Europa and the white bull, which is Zeus. Europa is a Phoenician princess. She is kidnapped off a beach by the white bull. She's taken to Crete, and while there, she has a baby, and it's Minos. She has Minos and 2 other brothers for him, and he rules Crete. Minos marries Pasiphae, and when Minos refuses to sacrifice a bull to Poseidon, Poseidon curses Pasiphae to lust after the bull, and she bears the Minotaur, who lives in the labyrinth at Knossos, which was constructed by Daedalus. Daedalus escapes the Minoans using wax wings, and his son Icarus flies too close to the sun. And then Minos will demand tribute from the Athenians after conquering Megara. And 7 boys and 7 girls are sent to Crete every 9 years, which I find very interesting because 9 years is how often he's supposed to talk to Zeus. And the tributes are said to be given to the Minotaur for the Minotaur to eat. And then Ariadne decides to help Theseus slay the Minotaur, and then the two escape Crete, but then Theseus abandons Ariadne, and she ends up marrying Dionysus and becoming a goddess. And then Theseus marries Ariadne's sister, Phaedra, and then Phaedra is going to fall in love with her stepson, Hippolytus, and that story is told by Euripides, which is another great play to read, and I love Medea. That's my favorite Euripides. The 19th century Europeans are going to believe that Cretan civilization didn't really begin until the first Olympic Games. That's around the 8th century BC. So they're going to be living in this world where King Priam of Troy and Agamemnon of Mycenae and Minos of Knossos, that they are just poetic myths. The early efforts of historians was to find proof of the epics, to draw history out of myth. And then Heinrich Schliemann is the one who does find actual proof of Troy and the Mycenaean Greeks. And then Arthur Evans is going to be our boy here in Crete, and he was searching for Minos and Knossos. Heinrich Schliemann's excavations in the later part of the 1800s are what uncovered the evidence of Troy and Mycenae, and they were proof that places that were mentioned in the epics were true. And so it really kicked off the archaeological studies of the Aegean Bronze Age, because suddenly it's hey, these places are real. Maybe we need to go digging and find them. And this is where we're going to see a lot of tension in Bronze Age Aegean archaeology. So it starts out as we're looking very specifically for records of men from poems and sagas, and we want them to be real, so that is what we are searching for. So Schliemann is very well documented to have overdug in Troy and completely overreached his mark. He was so eager. He was thinking the first Troy, at the bottom of everything, is going to be the Troy that I'm looking for. And so he probably missed the Troy that he was looking for. This is not the Troy you were looking for along the way. So the way historians and archaeologists are trying to look at these sites now, which makes perfect sense and is the way they should be looking at it, is that these are Bronze Age sites, and they were centers of cultural and economic trade. They were significant in that real people lived there, and we need to be teasing out how these lives of these real people looked and not just be chasing after legends. And it would be so cool to find out that there was real evidence that these legends were a certain amount true, but that may not ever really be possible. What we can find, what we can know about the Aegean Bronze Age is the focus of modern archaeology. That brings us a little bit more into Crete, which is going to be our unique civilization. It's going to have Hellenistic roots. It's the first European civilization, and it was heavily influenced by the powers of the day. So we're going to be talking about the Middle Kingdom, about in the Near East, Babylon and Assyria, and this is going to greatly influence how Minoa develops. So it's if it is a European power, it is one that is very Near Eastern facing. In 1900, Arthur Evans is going to start to excavate at Knossos, and by 1904, Evans has revealed the entire palace. 1,000 tablets and a throne room with a stone throne that is still in place. In 1905, Evans is going to propose the chronology framework for Crete. It's a 3-part system, which is used in general archaeology at the time. So you have stone, bronze, iron, and then in Egyptian, you're going to have Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms. So Evans is just adapting a known convention to Crete. Today, the table, the graphic that it will be before you now, is by Stuart Manning, and it is broken into 3 different sections in the Aegean. So you're going to have the early Bronze Age 1 through 3, Middle Bronze Age 1 through 3, and late Bronze Age 1 through 3. In Greece and the Cycladic Islands, there's going to be separate dating systems. So it's helpful when comparing to have something like this chart that's in here. I'll put that as a graphic now on the screen. It'll be helpful to have that also with you so you can see kind of approximate years that are on that table. But the one from Stuart Manning does not have actual dates. So you kind of need both. I'm hoping to make for you, and hopefully I will succeed. Here is a table that combines those specifically for Crete. So this is our state of events. This is what we're putting forward as these are the years and these are the eras that we are looking for. So to explain this table, Once we leave the Neolithic, we enter the pre-palatial phase, and that means that they have not constructed the palaces, such as the one at Knossos that Arthur Evans is going to discover. This is the early Minoan period, and that in itself can break into 5-ish categories, and it spans from 3500 BC to 2100 BC. If we are putting that into a broader Mediterranean context, in the Near East, that is when Sumer, this end period, 2100, it is when Sumer is rapidly degrading in power and Egypt goes through its first intermediate period. 2100 BC is sort of a century of transition. From there, we are going to enter the Middle Bronze Age. For Crete, that is going to encompass the Proto-Palatial or Old Palace period and the start of the Neo-Palatian or New Palace period. So Middle Minoan is going to date from around 2100 to 1600 BC, and somewhere around there in that 600 to 1500 BC time period, there's going to be a volcanic eruption at Thera, which is modern-day Santorini, and somewhere around there, Mycenae or the mainland Greeks gain control of at least the administrative side of Crete. The Late Bronze Age, or the Late Minoan period, which lasts from, say, 1600 to 1050 BC, breaks into about 6 separate subgroups of the late Minoan phase. That includes the end of the Neopalatial stage, and then it enters the Monopalatial phase at Knossos, the final Palatial stage, and then the Post-Palatial stage. And isn't that confusing? How I would personally think of the Late Bronze Age is that there were some sort of ecological changes that the Greeks may have or may not have taken advantage of. It is clear that major cities were destroyed in Crete and that Mycenaean influences increased. Crete does recover economically from the volcanic explosion, but they may not have been independent any longer. The specifics are a bit murky and largely conjecture. At the end of the Bronze Age, that is going to be this period of decline from 1200 to 1000 BC. The Hittites and the Assyrians fall, Egypt is going to weaken, and the Mediterranean is going to destabilize. The Minoans are going to retreat from the coast and stop trading because of fear of piracy. And they're going to enter into what is called the sub-Minoan period. So they are never going to reach the same heights that they did during Minoan Crete. So that is our working timeline of Minoan Crete, and it is a very unwieldy system. If you aren't familiar with the nomenclature, because they're going to abbreviate when they're talking about this in journals, and they're going to expect you to know about it when you're reading it. So it's not as easy as just picking up a journal about Minoan Crete and reading it and expecting to really understand it, because they're not going to include dates. They're going to refer to things by their periods, but it's going to be in this way of like Middle Minoan 2A, and it's going to be like MM2A. And if you don't know what that means, you're not going to know what that means. Back to archaeology after that little side tangent. But this is the system that Arthur Evans sort of originates from Minoan Crete. It expands, it keeps going into the unwieldy beast that we see before us today. Evans was able to date quite a lot of what he found thanks to Egyptian artifacts that can be dated to Egyptian kings lists. So thankfully, Egypt is relatively reliable when it comes to dating. They were very interested in keeping accurate records. So archaeological historical dating uses the surrounding area to try and narrow down chronology, but not necessarily a date. What this means, and this is sort of what we get from Flinders Petrie in Egypt too as an archaeologist. I talk about Flinders Petrie in every video, it seems like. He's awesome. Not in the way he treats people, but in the way that he revolutionized archaeology. Dating sites comparatively, you're going to be looking at pottery, and you're going to say, if this pottery style develops here, like at this level in the dirt, and this over here, this pottery style over here at this other site, and it's at this level in the dirt, then we can assume that these two levels in the dirt date for about the same time because they are using similar styles of pottery. And that doesn't give you a date for the pottery. It just says that we can start comparing what was happening at these sites to each other because we have a general idea that they existed co-contemporaneously. Historical dating, on the other hand, is where you are attempting to draw out a real date, and that's where it's really useful to have Egypt and Assyria and Babylon running around because they were actively trying to date things. They were leaving astronomical records that we can track back to find a real date, and they were using these kings lists. They were keeping records for administrative purposes, and then they were talking to each other, and we have some of their correspondence. So if Egyptian pottery is found at a site of Kadashem Enlil I, and we know that pottery is marked that it's from, say, Amenhotep III. These kings exist co-contemporaneously. We're talking about the 14th century because we have a good idea that's when both of these kings lived. And then when we see pottery that is similar or that has similar stamps that is Minoan and it's existing at the same time as, say, the Egyptian option, then we can say, well, when this vase shows up in the record in Minoa, that gives us an indication that it is also existing at the same time as the New Kingdom, and we're talking about 14th century BC. From this sort of jigsaw method of dating, we're going to also have radiocarbon dating. And for the early Bronze Age, that's going to be our main source of scientific dating. And it has highlighted some discrepancies within the archaeological record, which, as you can imagine, historians have loved. And to be fair, there are discrepancies with radiocarbon dating that I can understand why certain historians are taking issue. You have to have a really good sample, and carbon and trees and wood, it can be really messy trying to get an accurate sample to get an accurate date and time range. And that is all that I want to talk about that, because that is a very large debate within the Aegean Bronze Age academic community, and I am not an Aegean Bronze Age academic. So back to Arthur Evans. Arthur Evans is also the one who is responsible for naming the Minoans after Minos. And they wanted to separate it from the Mycenaean culture that's found on mainland Greek very specifically. And the civilization is very distinct. It has these frescoes and painted vases that depict scenes of like sea creatures and birds. And the basic character is understood today as a creation of Arthur Evans, thanks to his 4-volume work, The Palace of Minos. And it had over 10,000.
It's over 9,000!
references. So 10,000 archaeological entries within a work is extremely huge. It's crazy. And his perspective and what he put forward has really influenced the perspective that archaeologists had for a very long time. They really kind of viewed it as this sort of pastoral, peaceful, almost sort of like a kumbaya, everything's good here sort of place. And I think that there is some evidence to say that this perspective probably was influenced by a post-World War desire for the pastoral and the innocent naturalistic past. But since the work of Arthur Evans, archaeological dig sites have expanded pretty exponentially. New sites have been partly excavated and published, including several towns, villages, farms, shrines, and caves. Human sacrifice remains have even been found in 1979 on Mount Joktas. The study of Minoan stone seals and clay ceilings developed into a major research branch that's almost its own like sub-branch of Minoan studies, and also the regional styles of pottery have been heavily studied and classified. Thera, modern-day Santorini, is the Pompeii of the Aegean, so archaeologists have been able to unseal a town that included preserved Cretan pottery and frescoes. And then in 2015, a sea warrior was found from 1500 BC, and that was discovered at Pylos, which is to say that understanding Crete today still at times is a bit sketchy, and it is based on conjectures, but so many advances are being made that picture is becoming less and less murky every year. I would be pretty remiss up front to not just immediately dive into Cretan art and their frescoes really specifically. The art of Minoan Crete is very different from anywhere else in the Aegean Bronze Age. Since they did not have a centralized authority, that means there are not monuments. The reason you build a pyramid or an obelisk or anything like that, it's because you have a king who wants you to build that. So if you don't have that, what kind of art do you make? And if you don't have kings that want specific events recorded on walls at temples, what kind of events are you recording? Art is not just for the king. It seems to be a fairly widely distributed commodity, and the elite do have more access to Minoan art, but it is something that was available to the common people and did in fact cater to the common people's tastes. So Minoans have shown a love of color and decorative embellishment. Minoan art was designed to have an immediate effect on the viewer. So it's meant to be beautiful. You're supposed to notice that it is beautiful. It is often shown as natural, and it shows nature as beautiful. In Egypt and the Near East, where nature is sort of seen as this chaotic wanting to kill you thing. You know, if you leave your urban center, nature is actually something that is not beautiful. It is something that is seeking to kill you. Whereas when you're looking at Crete, it's a beautiful Mediterranean island. The art reflects that view of nature, that it is, in fact, a beautiful Mediterranean island. There are 4 main types of art expression within Minoan Crete. That's going to be our frescoes, our seals, our pottery, and our jewelry. So a fresco is a painting that is made on wet lime plaster. You are painting while it is wet, and then when it dries, it's very durable form of painting. And it can be very brightly colored. And in Minoan art, it is depicting processions, dancing, bull hunting and leaping, communal gatherings. A house fresco might show a landscape, worship, or even narratives. The natural forms in Cretan fresco are very unusual and often depict an idealized version of nature. In the main room of a home, a landscape might be common, whereas in a sleeping quarters, you might have some sort of shrine to a god or goddess that's meant to protect the sleeper. And when you were thinking of Minoan Crete, you were probably imagining a bull leaper or an octopus done in fresco. So it's one of the most distinctive aspects of the civilization. Seals were another form of nature art, and I will end up bringing them up a lot in this video. What they were for is some form of individual identification and probably some sort of like good luck charm. They often had a hole kind of bored into them so you could wear them as jewelry or like put them somewhere on your body. In contrast to, say, an Egyptian amulet or a Near Eastern worship scene. So an amulet is meant to protect you from like evil spirits or scorpion stings or snake bites. And then in the Near East, you're going to be looking at some form of worship. In Crete, it is much more likely that you were looking to identify yourself in a more individual way. So you might have some religious scenes of personal worship, but you also might have writing on them. You might have them personalized to reflect your job or something that you really like, or something that you just really identify with. It's your personal identification. So it's not going to be as strict as this is just for personal worship. As for exports in art, while there are examples of frescoes outside of Crete, specifically in Egypt, most art that was exported from Crete was pottery and jewelry. Minoan clay vases are always decorated. So they're going to use spirals, maritime scenes, or flower motifs. As for jewelry, it was worn by both men and women in Crete, and they made diadems, they made hairpins, bracelets, pendants, necklaces, and general clothing ornamentation. And it became more and more common and more complex as Minoan society became more complex and more wealthy. From there, we're going to jump to geography. Mountains are the backbone of the island, the landscape of Crete. And I'm going to get this right, and I'm going to say it in kilometers and in miles. Crete is 260 kilometers or 160 miles long, and it is 8,261 square kilometers in area or 3,190 square miles. Crete is about the size of Puerto Rico, if that is a helpful way to envision the size of it. It is a patchwork of small, separate valleys and plains. The landscape of Crete enabled the creation of kind of these small peer communities. So peer communities would be they're relatively equal in size and reach and what they're capable of doing. This is the antithesis of the large kingdoms of Mesopotamia and Egypt. So we're not talking about large population centers. We're talking about local regions with natural rivalries that are even going to form within them. So it's competitors and it's competitive. And as someone from Appalachia within the United States, it kind of reminds me of like a holler. Probably that is a generalization, but an isolated valley is very easy to form independent communities and like a fully separate culture from other independent valleys. Much of Crete's landscape is going to be well-watered springs that are good for agriculture, and it did not require heavy agriculture with centralized control the way that Egypt or Mesopotamia did. They did not have to do a whole lot of irrigation canals to make agriculture work. It was something that a small farm could do for themselves. They did not need to have the whole community get together to be sure that all the farms were watered. So a farmer can kind of handle his own space. Metals were unavailable, and that encouraged a turn towards seafaring to acquire those precious metals. Much like our Andean mountain civilizations, Crete was using vertical zone agriculture. So the zones were at the sea, the low and high plains, and finally on mountains. The most popular way to live in these environments was through fishing, farming, and shepherding. Some groups maintained a separate summer and winter home, and they would grow crops at both locations and then just move the herds between them depending on what season it was. In the coastal plains, the best agriculture is going to be there on the island, and it's where the crops that developed were cereals, grapes, legumes, and olives, and the region did not have harsh winters of a higher elevation. So around sea level plains, that's where you're going to have your best agriculture on Crete. And the foothill and the elevated plains, and that's going to be from about 300 to 800 meters or 1,000 to 2,600 feet. Crete is going to grow cereals, grasses, and cherries. Olives don't do well that high because you're starting to get a little bit colder. And the high mountains, so that's going to be around 800 to 2,400 kilometers or 2,600 feet to 8,058 feet, which is Mount Ida. That's the tallest peak on Crete. There are going to be forests and oaks and cypress and pine, and this region is home of the wild mountain goat. Traditionally, Crete is one of the highest density agriculture populations. That's people living on farmland per square mile in Europe. Even reaching back into the Bronze Age, this is not a densely urbanized population. This is an agrarian population that's going to be spread out. So while the Cretan population is one of the highest in the Aegean, and it was the basis of Minoan political strength. So you need a decently high population in order to go out and do the level of trade that we're going to be talking about with the Minoans. Traditional life in Crete would have depended very much on the crops, the domestic animals, hunting and gathering of wild plants, and its main agricultural exports are going to be olive oil and grapes and raisins and wine, with raisins and wine being a natural offshoot of the grape. Domestic animals are going to be the sheep and the goat, with herds being driven up and down mountains in April or May. And then cheese is going to be a natural byproduct of that, and that's going to be stored in these stone huts. Families are going to keep a goat for milk and then a pig for meat. Beehives were probably common because honey is a great source of calories. And then a family might have a cow for plowing and then a donkey for pack muling. Most families probably had a working dog of some form. This is the Cretan working dog. Crete is home to 1,700 plant species, which is pretty darn biodiverse, and their aromatic plants are going to be common and in abundance. So these plants are going to be used for medicine, for preservatives, for dyeing, and for mosquito repellent. Fall plowing and sowing are going to be the largest task of the year, and that's going to be before the heavy winter rains, and that's going to be up in the higher elevations that they do that, and then they're going to move down into kind of more of the coastal region for the winter where it's not as harsh. Winter is going to be a time for getting your handicrafts done. So you're going to be doing your looming and your carving and your ceramics and things like that. You're doing tasks at home when you don't really want to be outside because it's cold. And then the spring and fall is going to be when agriculture and herding season kicks back off again. Crete is kind of like a stepping stone functionally between the Aegean and then the Near East. So it was a connecting point for the Aegean islanders and the Greek mainland, and Crete is also open to traveling within the broader Mediterranean. So they acted as a go-between for the Near East and the Aegean. Crete is far enough away from the Near East that they were able to be exposed to those ideas without it totally taking over their culture. So they maintain themselves as an Aegean population, but they're able to take in ideas from Egypt and from Babylon and then reinterpret those and integrate them into their culture without losing that culture. They're not isolated, but they're isolated enough, if that makes sense. This agrarian model where they're, doing their shepherding and their agriculture, and then they're going to be doing their mercantile base. It's essential to the culture of Crete, and broadly, it became very middle class. There were elites, and there would come to kind of being a more broad rule over Crete eventually when we get to that monopalatial phase much later in the later Bronze Age. But that process is really slow, and it still is debatable how much control the monopalatial state and Knossos even had over the island. So more or less, Crete is going to be our first fairly literate society in linear A and then linear B. It's not normal to have a population be able to read as well as we assume the Minoan Cretes were able to. And then we're going to have kind of Minoan Crete perhaps as this sort of stepping stone onto Hellenistic roots and to Western civilization. And there is something about it that does feel very classically Greek. You've got this kind of widely distributed agrarian population with a strong literate middle class. That does feel classically Greek by Bronze Age standards, I should say also for that middle class part. This is like a modern perception of middle class that is being put onto a group of people that by like the Bronze Age standards were middle class, but not by like modern standards. So caveat. So we're going to move into history now with the Neolithic period and then go into the early Bronze Age and see how this population organized itself before we get to the Palatial period. And that gets going in about 2000 BC. So let's speed run Neolithic and early Minoan. Once upon a time, it was really cold. And that was the Paleolithic period. It was the Old Stone Age. It got warmer. And that was what we call the Holocene. We're still living in the Holocene. And humans figured out that if they threw down some seeds and they came back next year, those seeds might have grown into plants. And then agriculture really took off from there. This discovery that you could maybe plant some seeds and get some food out of it within your migratory pattern. And then as we go, we're going to have some animal husbandry picking up. We have some selective breeding taking place. And then from about 10,000 BC to 4,000 BC, the Neolithic period or New Stone Age, hunter-gatherers are slowly transitioning into a more settled way of living, and they are experiencing what is called the agricultural revolution. You don't need to think that they're immediately becoming fully agrarian. We should assume that somewhere between 20 to 50% of their caloric intake is coming from some form of agrarian activity. So we're still seeing a lot of hunting happening. But then instead of everything staying really warm and not very seasonal, seasons started to happen. And the climate got a little more temperamental. And at this point, a fair number of humans had probably settled down enough, and their population had probably grown enough that there wasn't a way for them to go back to being Paleolithic hunter-gatherer style people any longer. And if you think about this, it's because it's been a few thousand years. They have forgotten certain knowledge. They don't know how to do the things that a Paleolithic traveling group knew how to do. They know how to be Neolithic farmers now. And so instead of going backwards and cutting their losses and probably losing a fair chunk of their population to do it, they decided to move forward further into agricultural, to lean in and start organizing effectively together so that they could grow more crops, even in a more temperamental season. They do that, they form their innovations for agriculture, they form their communities, they start digging those irrigation ditches and canals, and suddenly you have a surplus of food, and then you start getting specialization of skills, urbanization, and bada bing, bada boom, you got some civilizations popping up. And that's how the model sort of works when we're looking at Sumer and Egypt in the Mediterranean. But here in Crete, we don't have it quite that way, because the people who moved to Crete already have a certain understanding of agriculture and animal husbandry when they get to the island. So they're not reinventing the wheel wholesale on Crete. That is why it is not a first civilization. It's just an ancient civilization. So our earliest signs of people on Crete is from the Paleolithic period, so probably 130,000 BC. But those groups were crossing the Mediterranean on boat. They were probably seasonal populations, and the first wave of like permanent settlers probably didn't arrive until, say, 7,000 BC from Anatolia. Anatolia being Asia Minor or the coast of Turkey. During the Neolithic period, settlements were few. But we're going to have Knossos that's going to be settled relatively early, and it's going to grow over 2,000 years to form an artificial mound. So what the settlers brought to Crete are going to be barley, lentils, sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle, and similar to the agricultural products that are found in the co-contemporaneous Anatolia and Syria. So by the late Neolithic period, we're going to start seeing populations somewhere around 300 to 600 people. The earliest clear evidence of religion on Crete are going to be these Neolithic figurines. They may be related to the universal mother goddess figure that pops up throughout Afro-Eurasia. They could also be representative of a specific Cretan god or goddess that would develop more distinctive characteristics later on. So we're talking about like our Artemis, our Aphrodite. Our transition from Neolithic to early Minoan is probably very slow. While new technologies are coming in from Sumer and probably had some impact. The change in climate to more extreme seasonality really kind of just marks the emergence of our modern Mediterranean climate. We're still not talking about extreme seasonality the way we might be in other places. Crete transitioned a little differently than our Egyptian and Near Eastern neighbors, and households may have started moving actually to a more independent mindset of living instead of into a closer, more urbanized version of living, because they did not have to work together to farm. You didn't need a centralized power forcing everybody to work together to farm. So they're able to spread out a little bit and do some more independent farming. What we have is the beginning of these kind of small farms that are developing, and agriculture is chugging along. And then we switch over into the early Minoan period. So the early Minoan period is going to last from 3500 to 2100 BC, and it basically lines up with the early Bronze Age. Early Minoan can be broken down into 5 subsets. That's going to be early Minoan 1A, early Minoan 1B, early Minoan 2A, early Minoan 2B, and then early Minoan 3. In any texts or journals, that's going to be how they're notated. So it'll be like EM 1A, not unconfusing at all. The early Minoan period is going to take the overall transition from communal living to household living. So that means we're moving away from living in these tight communities to living into our more individual family-focused farms. The first elites are going to develop throughout this shift, and Neolithic Crete enters the Bronze Age in contact with the surrounding Aegean. Sometime during that Neolithic period, they had boats and they were talking and trading with the other Cycladic islands in mainland Greek, and the coastal towns, we can tell, benefited from this talking and early trade. So they're going to be a little bit more successful than the interior of Crete. We're going to be seeing the appearance of ceramic painted vases, which shows a specialization of skills. So that means that we're having enough resources that Crete's able to start developing something that other people want. The vases were highly desirable very early on because they were very pretty. There's a joke that I've seen pretty recently actually on the internet that the one thing ancient civilizations all agree on is that everyone just loves a good vase. And the reason for that is because it is the first rat-proof version of storage. So the reason you're going to see agriculture and the vase appear at about the same time is because you need something to put your grain in that a rat can't get to. And thankfully they can't gnaw through ceramics. Therefore, vase, stone and clay. Metallurgy production is going to intensify in this early Minoan period, but Crete is really low on metals. So if we're talking about like a Sparta and Catan, they did not get iron ore. They have to go get the iron ore. And so they're trading for those raw goods and materials, and did that throughout the Aegean. I talk about pressure points a lot in my videos, and this is very clearly a pressure point. What reason do the Minoans have for wanting to go out and get metals? You need metals to make weapons. Say you're worried about an invader. Say you're worried about this rival village or hamlet that's over here. You need the latest and greatest in metal technology so that you can have the latest and greatest in weapons technology. So you are going to go out and sail where you can sail and get your metal and bring it home and build some good weapons. And then you can go stab people who are threatening to take away your pretty painted vases instead of giving you fair market value for them. That is what they did. That is why we see so many weapons on Crete. Cretan men use a dirk or a slim sword, sort of like a dagger. And there are more weapons on Crete compared to contemporary Greece or the Cycladic islands. So this is implying an aggressive culture develops really early on. Once they're seeing everybody else's cool stuff, the focus of the Minoans is going to switch from being just towards the Aegean to looking outwards into the broader Mediterranean. So we're talking about Egypt and we're talking about the Near East. We can see early on with funerary practices, that's the case. And then these seals, the talismans I've talked about, they come pretty early on into the record too. And those seals also are going to be what give us the suspicion that there's going to be a really early high level of literacy with Crete. The first written script that we're going to have, there are some Cretan hieroglyphs and then there's Linear A, neither of which have been particularly interpreted. Moving on from there, we're moving on to ceremonial central places. And these locations are going to be where a community comes together and does some form of worship most likely. And these central places are going to be the location that our later palaces are built on, which are not really palaces in the way you're thinking because it's not a king, but we will get to that when we hit Middle Minoa. We also know that once we get into the later early Minoan to early Middle Minoan, we're going to have some uses of caves that were used as Neolithic burial sites, but then they're going to become places of religious worship also. The populations are going to expand pretty dramatically around 3100 BC. So we're going to have some new groups of immigrants coming in from the Cycladic Islands, and then we're going to have like hundreds of these new little sites developed on the coast. The food is going to get better. There's going to be barley, there's going to be wheat, oats, olives, almonds, grapes, figs, goat cheese, and yogurt. Talk about something that is a great caloric powerhouse. You're going to be able to get your protein, your fat, and your sugar. You don't have to butcher an animal to get it, but you're still getting protein. The olive also is going to get domesticated in the early Minoan period, we think. And then olives are able to yield double the calories than, say, a cereal grain for the same agricultural space. So an olive is going to be a great way to get your calories in. And remember, this is what the Bronze Age, this is what early communities, it's the Neolithic period too, but Neolithic and early Bronze Age are going to be so concerned about where are you getting your calories and are they high quality calories. Yeah, it's great if you have enough grain for everybody and everyone gets to eat bread. But from a caloric, sustenance standpoint, what Crete's going to be providing with olives, with yogurts, with grapes, with citrus fruits, with almonds, you're going to have a lot more variety in your diet. And there is a certain amount of mutton, with goat, with pig, there's meat too. This Mediterranean diet is developing so early on, and it is so good for this population. So they're healthy, they're strong, and they can afford to eat the good food too because they're not just all poor. They're relatively middle class and working on their own personal farms in smaller communities. Early Minoan too, what a thing to say, is going to be 2900 to 2200. And so while Crete is going to have some low-grade metals, the majority of the sources are going to come from the northern Aegean and eastern Levant. And then that's going to be obsidian, abrasive stones, copper, and tin are going to be imported from the Aegean. You need copper and tin to make bronze. By the mid-2000 BC, all of the Aegean is going to have entered into kind of this economic interconnectedness and prosperity. And on Crete, our main locations for that are going to be at Knossos, Phaistos, and Mallia, which are going to reach the size of small towns at this period. So that's going to be somewhere around 700 to 200 people within a population. Tombs and their contents, so here we are, we're talking funerary archaeology, are very useful for understanding the Minoans' ideas about the dead and the afterlife. So at Phaistos and at Moklis, the dead are going to be buried in tombs, and then they're going to be sloped so that they're facing the settlement. So this is going to imply that it's viewed that the dead are going to have some sort of influence on life on the living. They're facing into it so that dead aren't put somewhere else. Whereas what we're going to see at, say, Mallia is that they're going to bury their dead at shore lines, and the sea is going to have some sort of special place in the burial practices. And that's kind of reminiscent of Egypt and the Nile. The deceased are going to be provided for with their daily belongings, maybe special objects for continued use in the afterlife. A man's going to have a dagger and his personalized seal. A woman's going to have her necklace and maybe some tweezers, and perhaps a figurine, some sort of mother goddess figurine is going to be buried with her. Both are going to have vases, a jug, a cup, kind of these things that you might need for the afterlife to eat. Stone vases, when those are found, are implying really expensive funerary offerings. Hi, this is Maverick. Stone vases are going to kind of be our more expensive funerary object, and they're going to be used to store cosmetics or perfume, and perfume is going to be oil with some of those aromatic herbs that we talked about earlier, which are pretty common on Crete. The dead sometimes were even buried with a model house, like what we would see on Egypt burial goods. So we can assume they're in contact. We can assume that they're exchanging some funerary ideas. Also similar is going to be our bull cult. And in the Near East, the bull that most people would know would be the one that Gilgamesh has to kill, the bull of heaven, which is going to be Taurus. And then in Egypt, we're going to have the Apis bull, which begins probably somewhere around 6000 BC, which is where this bull is an actual god that comes in a reincarnated cow form. So bull cults are very common in Egypt and the Near East, and it's going to make its way over to Crete and to the Grecian mainland too. The Minoan bull, remember Zeus and Europa is a story. It's going to represent fertility. And so the men are going to wrestle a bull into submission. And this might be kind of one of those early precursors to bull leaping. And that's going to be a really popular motif within Minoan art. Jewelry and seals are going to be made out of imported gold, silver, ivory, But most early Minoan seals were carved out of animal bone or soft stones. So we're not really looking at like fancy Minoan seals yet. Trade is going to slow down during the intermediate period and kind of through that 2100 period. Egypt is going to go through one that ends once the Middle Kingdom kind of happens, and that's going to be when actually we start seeing Cretan goods re-enter the Egyptian market and vice versa. Interestingly, lots of places that say the circa 2000, 2100 BC period have some sort of slowdown, and it does seem to be sort of a period of transition on the Afro-Eurasian continent. So from there, we're kind of moving on this transitional point into Middle Minoa 1A, which is going to be 2100 to 1950, which is not a long time. So at the end of the 2000s BC, we're going to be experiencing that new prosperity and expanded international contact with Egypt and Levant. And that's going to be when Egypt gets its head back on straight with the Middle Kingdom. And Egyptian political stability means that we're going to have stability with Babylon over here in the Near East eventually, and the Assyrians eventually, and then Minoa basically can take advantage of that because those greater powers are dealing with piracy. They're dealing with their own piracy too, but the greater powers are going to be what keeps a lot of that stable. Though Egypt, it should be noted, are no great seafarers, so they kind of want the trade to come to them. They're not looking to get in a boat and sail anywhere other than the Nile. The Nile is easy. It's almost like cheating how easy the Nile is. But what we can take from this is that early Minoan 3, and this is kind of that 2100 transition point, there's going to be some more heavily fortified defensive locations and architecture, and that there's sort of more of a defensive nature to the sites chosen for Middle Minoan. This is suggesting that there's sort of these uneasy relationships between other groups on the island. And remember, in early Minoan 2, we're talking about a very heavily armed population, and that's going to continue on through Middle Minoan. There was a major expansion in the urban population at Knossos that's going to be growing from, say, 6,000 to 11,000 people over the Middle Minoan period, and then Phaistos is going to reach from 7,500 up to 10,000, and Malia is going to be at about 5,000 people. So these are still not the large urban populations that we would be seeing in the Near East in, say, 2000 BC, but they're growing on Crete. Tombs are really paralleling what we're going to find as grave goods in the contemporary Byblos, Egypt, and Anatolia regions. So you would want to be buried with foreign goods, not necessarily because like you think the foreign goods are great, but because possessing knowledge of foreign places, and that gives you a certain amount of power. And then from Egypt, we're going to see funerary architecture like the mastaba be imported into Crete. This is really resembling these Egyptian tombs at the time, and death practices in Egypt are becoming a little bit more democratic, which is a weird thing to say, but let me explain. During the intermediate period, it stopped being this focus that the reason you build pyramids and have the Book of the Dead and all this other stuff is just for the pharaoh, because right now we don't have a centralized controlled pharaoh. The idea is that this pharaoh is the god on earth. When he dies, he's going to go to the afterworld, and he's still going to have an effect on your world, individual. And so, because the pharaoh still has an effect, you need to feed him and leave funerary objects. You need to be sure that he has all the stuff he needs for the next life. And so he's going to be happy, and he's going to treat all of us who are left behind really well. Well, in this intermediate period, the idea becomes that, well, hey, if he gets to have a great afterlife, maybe I can have a great afterlife. And that's going to be when we start seeing these like Book of the Dead texts appear in more middle class graves and artisan graves instead of just exclusively in a pharaoh or a priest's grave. And as we've discussed now a few times, Crete is a much more middle class sort of place. So this idea is being disseminated from traders probably in Egypt up into Crete. And they're saying, yeah, I want a mastaba. I want my family to leave me some cool stuff. I want to be buried with these things from Egypt, because if they're going to have a good afterlife, I too would like a good afterlife. And this is how you get it. I guess I should also say a mastaba, I've probably already thrown up an image, but it's kind of like the flat bottom surface of a step pyramid. So when you think of a step pyramid, that's going to be like mastaba, mastaba. But a mastaba doesn't have to be like this huge thing. It can be relatively small, just like a pyramid actually can be relatively small. And it can just be kind of like this nice marking place, this kind of flat area where your family can leave behind some food for you, or a little like ceremonial shrine activity once you're dead. Because we're making this argument that Minoan Crete is relatively middle class. What is interesting is that it does seem a large portion of the population had access to these sorts of funerary rites and funerary burials. So that means that if everyone is being treated in this relatively kind of egalitarian, similar way, it means that everyone can afford to be treated in this egalitarian, similar way. Because this is a trade economy. Middle Minoan 1B and Middle Minoan 2. Who came up with this? Arthur Evans. So 1950 to say 1700 BC is known as the proto-palatial phase. So let's talk about palace structures. So Arthur Evans interpreted the large court building he excavated at Knossos as residence of a dynasty. But you would be hard pressed to say that a king immediately lived in Knossos at the palace. It would be more accurate to call it probably like a court compound. There were sites of communal ceremonial spaces before, so they probably continued on in that purpose, but just kind of got like jazzed up. Probably was some sort of priest type person who lived there, or some sort of administrative individual. Even in the Near East, or say in Egypt, you're not going to have your priests and your kings living at the same locations. And actually, a priest at a temple, that's going to be where you have your stone structure, whereas a palace is not made out of stone. The funerary places, the temples, anything that's meant to be for the gods, that's something you build out of stone because it's meant to last forever. Whereas what you build for the living can degrade. So that we're not going to waste our stone materials on that. But it doesn't really seem like there's a lot of evidence for this king that's living in this palatial structure. So it's not like King Minos's palace, probably. It's probably like a place where priests live. Probably they received a certain number of tithes to support them, and probably they did their ceremonial activity, which the community could be a part of. The first Cretan political state does appear in Middle Minoa, we're pretty sure, and it's like the construction of the compounds and peak sanctuaries. They do suggest some form of authority who's getting people to build these things. The older point of view is that the Minoans simply accepted the Near Eastern and Egyptian culture. They are like, they have a king, so we should have a king, but probably that's not too likely. Probably it's more that there was some sort of authority who they sort of adapted, but probably had very limited control in actuality or administratively. We do get references to a king in the ancient world, but there's just not a lot of evidence for centralized control. But this makes sense, because much in the way that Minoans are going to be importing seals, but they don't use them the same way that the Near East did, it's more realistic to say that the Minoan state is drawing from what they see about them. They're taking what they like, and they don't necessarily adapt all of it. So there is a record of, say, a king of Crete that's mentioned by a priest during the time of Thutmose III, who is a 14th century Egyptian dynasty, or a 14th century Egyptian pharaoh during the New Kingdom. He really may have been a ceremonial figure, and his main role probably was just to supervise communal religious activities, which really takes the shine off the Minos myth, doesn't it? For trade, large amounts of Minoan pottery are going to appear at the Aegean and Mycenae and Argos and Thero, and along the whole of the Anatolian coast in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. The Middle Minoan shift is going to be that it stops being just like there's some evidence of trade with Egypt and the Near East to there's a great deal more of trade. And we're going to see some evidence that trading routes are specifically coming over to where the Minoans are going to be from, say, Africa or from further out into the Near East, and they're wanting Minoan objects to take and to trade. Syrian merchants began to send the caravans with silver, gold, tin, textiles. Minoans are going to provide their luxury items in exchange. So their colorful and decorative fine wares were produced by potters were really a very sharp contrast to what we see in the Near East, where theirs is not nearly as decorative, not nearly as fine. Theirs are pretty drab, actually. So the Minoan contrast, this is a luxury good you would want. And then we're going to see the society in Crete change a little bit with more and more introduction of literacy. Middle Minoa was really off and running when it came to literacy. The original stimulus for literacy probably is the expanded trade state, which is pretty standard. The bureaucracy to kind of keep track of things, that's a big reason for literacy to expand. This doesn't necessarily apply a overall authoritarian IRS type state or anything. It just could be that elite households were looking to keep track of what was being traded. Population at Knossos is going to reach around 17,000 people. The palace, we think, is built around 1900 BC on that central hill. And then the cities that were then going to be surrounded by farms that are going to support from an agricultural standpoint. The end of the proto-palatial phase is going to be around 1700 BC. It's going to mark a distinct destruction of many Cretan sites. The first palaces at Knossos and Phaistos are going to be violently destroyed. Some say earthquakes. It's a theory, but there is evidence that there were fires at the sites. Violence between regional states really may be the cause here. The second palatial phase is going to be the mature Minoan state, the neo-palatial state, 1700 to 1450 or so. And this is when Minoan culture is going to be at its most developed, and it's going to culminate in late Minoan 1A, and the social and political organization, the levels of literacy, the settlement size, those are going to be at their greatest during this time. So the palaces are going to be rebuilt after the destruction that happens in Middle Minoan 2, and they are now going to be on their second palatial phase. So Crete at this point is going to have the largest settlements in the Aegean. Knossos is going to become the dominant kingdom on Crete. When other cities come under its political control, its local peak sanctuary is going to be put out of commission, and they're going to now be beholden to the Knossos leading religious power to be making the sacrifices for the community, and they're asserting control by asserting religious control. Most of the late Minoan population is going to be more urban. So Knossos is finally kind of establishing a more urban reputation. We're looking at maybe 40,000 people now as the population. We're seeing the palace move into more of a centralized ceremonial administrative location. The landscape is going to be densely settled. It's going to be hamlets and single farmsteads and shepherd compounds. And there's going to be a really extensive network of trade on the island itself. Because remember, there's a lot of regional pottery and regional seals and regional ideas. And this is going to be when they're their highest level of communication and trade on the island. We're going to see kind of our most extreme version of a class structure during Middle Minoa 2. We're going to have our noble elites, and that's going to include maybe some sort of ruler or high priest and the nobles. And they're going to be the ones who are dining at the palace and living around the palatial structure. Priests and nobles maybe have villas and surrounding agricultural communities. The upper class are going to be the merchants who live in these large townhouses. The middle class are going to be artisans who live in these kind of more spatial rubble houses in towns and villages. And then the lower class are going to be the farmers and the shepherds who live in small rubble houses and huts. And then we're going to have some evidence of slaves and serfs who are living in a single room or in small quarters. At a basic level, houses are going to contain an entrance, a storage area, and food for animals, a workspace for food prep and other industries, and a social center. And then on the second floor is going to be where you have your residential sleeping quarters. Rural regions were probably led by a local villa that's going to be kind of our administrative center of that region. And then they're probably going to have some ties to the larger urban sites and the larger urban villas. We're going to have just a Minoan state that is relatively competitive. So you're going to have these more of a city-state kind of feeling that's happening, where you've got a larger urban center with smaller urban centers that are attached to it, smaller villas, smaller regions. And then those are going to be inherently competitive with each other on the island of Crete. And then life expectancy is going to be about 35 for men, 28 for women. The childbirth is always gets the women. The war as always gets the men. And then, disease. Social roles that we're going to be looking at is men are going to be hunting. They're going to be getting the birds, the deer, the boar. Women are going to be kind of more egalitarian than a lot of other Bronze Age sites. We can see this a little bit in the religion. There's no male deity figure that we're going to be looking at like Baal, and Zeus hasn't really taken off yet. Sort of like these mother goddesses like Artemis, who are going to be in charge of the hunt. Minoan art shows us that music is going to be really important. So we're talking about the lyre, the flute, the trumpet, drums, rattles. Middle-class women are going to be the ones in charge of making textiles, which is a really valuable export. So if you're producing things that are valuable exports, you have an elevated role within the society. And clothing in general is going to be really decorative and really important in Minoan society. So men and women are going to be wearing their hair long. They're going to have nice clothing. They're going to be using jewelry to kind of be a nice embellishment to what they're wearing. Men are going to be wearing like this short kilt that's folded. So it's sort of like shorts, and then they're going to have probably an exposed chest without like a shirt or anything. And then men are going to be like, their role is going to be showing courage and physical ability. They're going to show that either by going to war or by taking part in these ceremonial war activities like bull leaping and things like that, running, hunting, boxing. The things you would think of it being at the Olympics, probably, except for the bull leaping. And they're being brought up to be like, you're here to protect society. You're here to protect our urban regional area away from their urban regional area in any kind of piracy or invasion that might come from the sea. Religious ideas are going to be expanding from Minoa outwards into the broader Aegean. So religious practices and peak sanctuaries and burial places, kind of their written language, are going to be shared outward from Crete. In the Aegean and in the Cycladic Islands, they're going to have a script that's very similar to Linear A, and we think has some sort of Indo-European root. Minoan pottery is going to continue to be exported in just really startling numbers to Cyprus, to Anatolia, to the Levant, to Egypt. And those locations are going to have huge amounts of pottery styles on Crete. So not only are the Cretians selling the pottery, they're also buying a lot of pottery from abroad and bringing it into Crete. The exchange is working both ways, with the Egyptian and Near Eastern themes being visible to the Cretans. The Egyptians do invite the Cretans in to paint some frescoes. They're not going to be adapting to Cretan art, but the Middle Kingdom and the intermediate period in Egypt is kind of known for this more adaptive art style that's not as rigidly to the 4th dynasty. When you think of Egyptian art, it's from the 4th dynasty, a lot of the motifs and theming and styling that you see. And a lot of Egyptian dynasties are trying to do a callback to that and say, like, we are very similar and powerful to the 4th dynasty. And, you know, once you're in the 18th dynasty and still doing the same art styles, that's our exchange. That's the like mature Minoa state that we're looking at. And then what we're getting in religion within the Minoan period is we're going to have these large communal ceremonies. They're going to be carried out on the palatial sites, and those sites, you know, before the palaces were built. Archaeology does not provide us any evidence that the worship on mountains happened until 2100 BC. So we're going to be entering into the Middle Bronze Age, not the Early Bronze Age. Minoans may have sought help from deities from Egypt or the Near East, and that's why they adapted their religious worshiping style and started doing the peak locations. Certain elite individuals may have gained power by claiming descent from Zeus and worshipped at Mount Joktus, and King Minos, you know, said to be the son of Zeus, so that makes sense. They're saying Zeus is born on Crete. Temple repositories and wall paintings from throne rooms are where most of Knossos records come from. So we are like almost looking at the pictures and the remains left and kind of making a guess at religious belief to a certain extent. We do have like some figurines that have maybe 3 separate distinct goddesses, and that's maybe Artemis and Aphrodite and Athena. And the solar cycle does appear to have played an important part in Minoan religion. So there's kind of this wavy shape that's on the back of the throne at Knossos, and we think that might be related to kind of the peak location at Mount Joktus. And so whoever's seated at the throne may have some sort of connection to the peak sanctuary and the blessings of the god. So we're going to have a variety of deities worshipped at these peak sanctuaries, but that's going to fade over time. And population loss after the Theran eruption and the growing power of Cnossian political reach probably explains why Crete gets a little bit more religiously cohesive as we're entering that monopalatial period. Families are going to be carrying out religious rites at small shrines too inside their homes and their family tombs. And family shrines are going to be like a small branch or an assemblage of religious items, such as like a female figurine or clay models of birds or beetles or shellfish. And funerary practice really become varied after Middle Minoan 1. The afterlife is probably thought of as some sort of like seaward journey for the dead, and the afterlife is kind of seen as more pleasant than maybe what we're seeing in the Near East and Sumer. And much like Egypt, it's probably some sort of like maritime water movement that one must make. The Minoan deities are going to begin as animal and women, and it's going to focus on protecting human beings and flocks in the natural world and fertility, and it's going to be connected to like wanting rain and like prosperous weather. So a nature goddess really reminiscent of Artemis is going to develop, and we're going to see connections to like Ishtar or Aphrodite kind of get imported in, and there are going to be some connections to, say, a male master of animals that's going to be similar to Gilgamesh or Enkidu, and that may be what develops into Apollo or Hermes. There's an absence in Minoan belief of a male volatile god such as Baal or Seth or Poseidon, and the predecessor to Zeus on Crete we think is probably like the son of a female deity. By late Minoan 3, we're going to have the Linear B text. We're going to have tablets mentioning Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Athena, Ares, Apollo. The whole gang's going to be there at the Greek pantheon. But when we're talking about Linear B, we're talking about Mycenaean influence. It's not just Cretan influence any longer. So these deities are going to continue on Crete and then elsewhere in the Aegean into the Iron Age, and those deities are going to evolve into the Greek pantheon that we're all very familiar with. So all of this to say, conclusion, this is so long. This is going to be so long. Okay. So late Minoan 1A, we're going to have the eruption at Thera that produced several earthquakes. We're going to have ashfall. We're going to have tsunami. The ash is going to kill the animals and the crops and probably poison some wells. We're going to see famine, food shortages, and severe social stress. The mainland of Greeks were probably not influenced by this eruption based on the weather patterns. So it's really going to be Crete that's heavily influenced by this volcanic eruption. There probably is some sort of at least economic vacuum that takes place, and probably mainland Greece is going to take advantage of that. And then within this, there's a whole lot of talk about pottery and metals and the Aegean and the broader Mediterranean. And why does any of this matter? Why does this effective trading matter? And it's because these are people with very distinct cultural identities. They're very different. They have different writings, ruling powers, ruling structures, ways of doing agriculture, ways of producing their goods. And they're trading ideas and they're trading those goods. And they are able to keep those separate identities without necessarily invading or encroaching upon them. This is globalization. We have started. That is so significant into the modern era today. So if someone says, like, when does globalization start? This is the Bronze Age with the Mediterranean is a good answer. And what their economies are going to be doing is they're so closely tied together that when one starts to decline, it affects all of them, which is what we're going to run into with the decline of the Bronze Age in 1200 BC, and we're going to have economic issues. In 1200 BC, we're looking at Egypt being less powerful. We're looking at the fall of the Hittites, the Assyrians. Babylon's not really a thing. So we're lacking in these strong world power to keep order within the Mediterranean at large. And so without a strong regional power, you're going to see piracy really pick up. Crete, who is not going to be as strong after this potential Theran eruption, they're going to move inland. They're not going to be as coastal and focused, and they're going to enter into their sub-Minoan period. Because trade's just too risky. It's not worth the risk to send out all of these goods and people if they're just going to get killed by pirates and stolen from. Crete was always going to be limited in their size and their geography. It was never going to be like this astronomical population size. It's just too limited by the mountains, by the valleys, by how many people an island can probably reasonably support. But it does feel like it has a really large impact. It does feel very classically Greek. It does feel like there are tendencies and things that we can take from this that have a Hellenistic root. Small but mighty. And, maybe that is a historian putting what she wants to see on Crete, much in the same way that Arthur Evans was probably putting what he wanted to see on Crete post-World War I. But then again, maybe not. Civilizations have to come from somewhere. Ideas have to come from somewhere. Anyway, thank you for watching this very, very long. I can't believe I'm going to have to edit this. Thank you so much for watching this very long video. I hope you have enjoyed it. My voice is shot. Please like and comment and let me know what you would like to see from us next. I think our next Hogwash History is going to be the Hittites. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Bye.